Welcome into the 2020 Top Buffs Countdown. Brian Howell, you've been contributing on Buff Stampede here recently. Excited to have you as part of the voting for it this year. What was kind of your experience as you were putting together not only the list of top returning guys, but also the top 10 newcomers? Because I'll explain a little bit in a bit how we're going to kind of change it up this year with no spring ball. What was that process like for you?
Well, first off, it was kind of nice to think about football and like
Yeah, yeah.
what kind of impact those guys could have. But for me, with that newcomers list, it was interesting to kind of put it in perspective of, for me, it was okay, who's going to play well this year? Who's going to impact this team this year? And trying to figure that out. And it's interesting, trying to figure that out because you don't know with the newcomers, especially the high school kids and the returners. A little bit easier at the top, I think, with a lot of those guys, but then there's some guys that there's a lot of unknown there as well, like with a Chris Miller, which I think he could have a big impact, but if he has the same injury history that he's had, obviously he's not going to have a big impact. So but it was, for me, the best part was just thinking about football and what kind of impact these guys can have actually on the field.
In the past, we did a top 40 countdown, and it was any guy that was on campus for spring ball was eligible for that. This year, there's no spring ball, which makes putting this list even harder to do. But I felt like I wanted to include those newcomers because a lot of them got on campus early, and I think there are quite a few guys. Again, this was one of the highest rated classes that CU's had in quite a while, so I didn't want to just keep them completely off the list. So I thought this was a way to do it. So we're going to start with the top 10 newcomers list. Like you said, my voting criteria was pretty similar to yours. It was more about the guys that I feel like have a chance to make an impact in 2020. It's hard to project 2, 3, 4 years down the road, and so unfortunately, I felt really bad because I think Carson Lee and Jake Ray have a case to be on the top 10 newcomers list, but just the way offensive linemen need to usually develop, I didn't have them on my list. They're not part of the honorable mention list. I felt kind of bad for that because those are two guys that I think are going to have really good careers at CU.
I totally agree with you, and I really didn't think of those guys for this list because of that reason. That as true freshman offensive linemen that didn't even get a spring ball, it's hard for me to imagine them getting on the field in 2020. I hope they can get on the field in 2020 because that means the Buffs are on the field. But as true freshman offensive linemen, I mean, I agree with you. Most linemen, it's going to be their third, fourth year in the program before they really start making an impact. I think those two guys could have a big impact in their career, just not this year.
Yeah. And one other note here, I decided Antonio Alfano wouldn't be eligible for this. He's simply for the fact that he was suspended for violation of team rules when the coronavirus shutdown began. Did you agree with that, or do you think he should be eligible for this list?
Yeah, I mean, I could have gone either way. I mean, I think that clearly, if he is eligible, I think he could be at the top of the list. But I think there's a realistic possibility he doesn't play it down ever for CU, and I don't really know, how realistic that is at this point. I mean, he's still suspended as far as we know, and you hope he has things together and plays, but I think right now it's probably best to leave him off. Another thing I want to add too is the receiver group. I didn't have any of the new receivers on my top 10 for the same reason as the offensive linemen. I just think the Buffs are so deep with some of those guys that are already here that those true freshmen may not get on the field a lot this year. But I agreed with you on Antonio.
Yeah. We'll jump into the honorable mention guys that were on at least one of William Gardner and Tyler Ziskin also voted, so I combined all four of our votes together. We'll get those guys on for some of their thoughts later in this countdown. Montana Lamonius Craig was not on either of our lists, but he was on William's list. He was on Tyler's list as well. I do think, while he was not on my list, I do think he's one of the more underrated signees in this class. He averaged almost 30 yards a catch as a senior, had 6 interceptions, could end up really playing on either side of the ball. Inglewood goes from 0-10 his junior year to 12-1 his senior year. And I really feel like if he had the season he had as a senior when he was a junior, there's no question that he's a 4-star recruit. It's just that sometimes, guys blossom a little bit later. Not that he had a bad junior season, but his team struggled so much that he really wasn't on the radar.
Yeah, I agree with you. I really like him in this class. I think that I remember on signing day, Yumi and Chase were kind of talking about that. I know Chase Howell loved him, and I think he's a very underrated recruit as well. I think he definitely could make a push for this list. And if we do something postseason, he might be on there.
Yeah. Keith Miller was on Williams' list. He's 6'5", 210. It looks like he's got the size to come in and compete. He was not on my list for exactly what you said a little bit earlier. Just a lot of talent at receiver, guys that have been in the program a little bit longer. But it wouldn't surprise me, again, with his size, if he has a role, especially maybe in the red zone. And
Yeah.
he really was a catalyst along with Carson Lee and Brandon Lewis and Brandon Rice in this class. He was a big part of being able to bring guys together and fill up this class.
Yeah, and I agree with you on that. And it just, I go back to what I said earlier about those receivers. You look at the time that Chev's been here, and I know a lot of it early on was like people thought, well, is it Mike McIntyre that's keeping those underclassmen receivers like LaVisca as a freshman, not really throwing him the ball? But the time that Chev's been here, those younger receivers have not really gotten into the mix. I mean, even Daniel Arias, that I thought would have a big year last year, didn't do a whole lot as a sophomore. So, it's going to be this year. Arias is a junior finally before we really see what he can do. So, I just think it's hard with, Katie Nixon. You got Arias, you got Dimitri Stanley, other guys I'm not even thinking of off the top of my head that I think they're going to get more catches their way. I could see like a Keith Miller, Montana, getting on the field, especially with that 4-game rule. But I don't think they're going to have a huge impact.
And credit to Cheverini, the fact that he keeps stockpiling talent year after year. This was a really impressive receiver class that brought in. William Anglin was also on Williams' list, didn't quite make the cut. I can see why he might be in consideration given the lack of depth at safety and given how athletic Anglin looks on film. And so it doesn't shock me that he's, an audible mention here, a guy that maybe I should have put more thought into given the lack of depth at safety. But it's just incredible with him now deciding to stick with CU. They've been able to keep that whole class together, which I didn't think was a possibility when Mel Tucker left.
Yeah, I agree with you. Especially, I thought nationally the Durrell hire was very underwhelming. I thought that you'd have not a ton of guys leave because they were already signed, but I thought you would have 3 or 4 or 5 guys leave. But ultimately, you don't have anybody leaving. And Anglin, I was told, initially that there was a family situation, and so hopefully that has been resolved. And we know obviously he had a close connection, or at least his high school coach had a close connection with Mel Tucker, and that's kind of what got him here. But hopefully this means he's been able to connect well with Durrell and the coaches here, and that he feels comfortable coming to CU. But I can see him on the list as well for the reason you mentioned, that safety is just not very deep.
Yeah, Anglin probably got screwed over more than anybody in that recruiting class because
Right. Mm-hmm.
Mel Tucker's from Cleveland, so he kind of took it upon himself to personally recruit him. He's in his living room convincing him to pick CU over Cincinnati. And then, of course, because he was one of the few late signees, and then Mel Tucker's out the door a few days later. We don't need to rehash all that, but Anglin had to feel pretty upset when he heard the news.
Yeah, and actually think about it. He picks CU over Cincinnati. Those were the 2 head coaches that Michigan State went after there at the end. So Anglin was probably pretty nervous there for a little bit. But, you had to feel for Anglin at the time just because of what you mentioned. I mean, there is that connection. He probably felt comfortable going to play for Tucker because of what his high school coach was telling him. And then Tucker leaves. So he probably had a lot to think about. And, I'm glad he's coming. I like him. I think he's a good prospect. I think he's a guy that down the road could be a very good player for CU. I just don't know if it's going to be quite in 2020.
And there's 2 more honorable mentions here. Brian, you had Matt Lynch and Jake Peters, 2 tight ends that are planning to transfer in as walk-ons. Kind of break down your reasoning behind including those guys in your top 10 list.
Yeah, I included them just because of, talking to Coach Durrell, talking to Cheverini. The tight end's going to be featured in this offense, and or at least a big part of this offense. And I think that bringing those guys in, there's a reason they did it, because they want them to play. These are guys that, Peters, now we don't know for sure if he'll be able to play, especially with that NCAA transfer rule now being shelved. I know he's put in a waiver to try to, be able to play, and he's hoping to. But I think Peters is a fantastic recruit who was just in the wrong offense in Arizona. He was a guy that committed under Rich Rod, would have been perfect for that offense. And then all of a sudden Kevin Sumlin comes in. There's no place for him in that offense. So I think he was just not a good fit there. I think he's a steal for Colorado, a guy that I think will be on scholarship at some point. He's been working out with Tyler Lytle out in Southern California this summer. and I got a picture sent to me. The dude is huge. That's a big guy. He's going to catch some passes. I think he's going to be a good tight end at Colorado. Matt Lynch is a guy, he's got a year to play. And I think there's a reason he's coming to Colorado. Obviously, it's home, but I think that there's an opportunity there for him to play and get on the field.
Either of those guys have success at CU, it's a great story because of what they both had to put up with at their last school. And with Peters, I think he's kind of hoping the situation at Arizona will help him get that waiver. The fact that he signed Rich Rod bolts on him, and just like you mentioned, just was not a good fit there. There's not always a consistent rhyme or reason with some of these decisions the NCAA makes, but he certainly seems, in my opinion, to have a case to play right away and to not be penalized for wanting to go somewhere else where he can actually have an impact.
Yeah, I agree with you. I look at some of those high-profile quarterback transfers that have somehow been able to play right away. And I think if that can happen, Jake Peters has got to be able to play right away as a walk-on. And so I think if he does, I think he could be a big part of this offense, or at least a key part of the offense.
All right, with that said, that's all the honorable mention guys on the top newcomers list. So we'll jump in to number 10, and that's Justin Jackson. He transferred in from Northwest Mississippi Community College, and he had some big schools coming after him. He took an official visit to Florida. I don't know if that was committable at the end, but West Virginia came in on him hard, made him really think in the days leading up to that signing period, but he decided to stick with the Buffs. With or without Alfano, it turns that this defensive line goes from a group that was woefully thin a year ago, and now all of a sudden you could make a case they could potentially have 8 to 10 guys in that rotation depending on health.
Yeah, it may actually be the strength of the defense right now when you look at overall depth, and I think Justin Jackson's a big part of that. And as you mentioned, if you get Alfano back, that even adds more to it. But I think Justin has a chance to come in and be a guy that plays, gets in the rotation. I think the starters are probably set. I mean, we'll see with the new coaching staff, but I think Justin could get in the rotation and be a big part of that defense.
Justin does have 3 years to play too, so he comes with that red shirt in his back pocket. They could theoretically redshirt him. You just don't see that happen a whole lot with JUCO guys. Usually you're bringing them in for a reason, and again, defensive line is probably the position where you can rotate the most. So I guess we'll see. They could potentially redshirt him, but I mean, based on where we have him on this list, I think we're kind of expecting him to be part of the mix.
Yeah, I think I'm expecting him to be part of the mix. And I think, with that 4-game rule, I think that helps. We did see some of that with Jamar Montgomery last year, came in as a JUCO kid. And off the top of my head, I don't remember. Did he play more than 4 games? Do you know?
Not off the top of my head, I'm not sure.
I don't remember. I know he didn't play for a while and then got into the mix towards the end of the season. But, maybe Justin is even that type of a player that it takes him a little bit to get acclimated, but then he's a rotational player second half of the year. But either way, I agree with you. They brought him in. They want him to play now.
Justin Jackson is a Mississippi native. He stayed there for junior college. He kind of got a little bit of a later start into his football career. He did have some non-Power 5 schools after him, but went the JUCO route. And it was really his sophomore season that he kind of started to blossom there. I mentioned some of the SEC program. There's in West Virginia, kind of looking at him late in the process, just outside the top 100 in the 24/7 Sports Composite JUCO rankings. So this is a good class when you've got a guy like Jackson at the tail end of it. And even that, the reason that he's probably even on this list is because he is a JUCO guy that you would theoretically think has a better chance to kind of step in right away.
Yeah, I agree with you. And, he's not one that when you think of this class, I don't think he's one of the first names you come to. But then as you get to him, you're like, wow, actually, okay, he can make an impact here. And, you could argue he might finish the year higher on this list. Again, if we do a postseason list, he's potentially a guy that could be maybe in that top 5 of the newcomers.
All right, so that's how we're going to start this out. We're going to keep going down the top 10 newcomers. Once we're done with that, we're going to do a top 30 countdown, and that's going to be the guys that were on the 2019 team that are returning. So we'll be back with number 9 on our newcomers list next.